After 15 years of training law enforcement officers in tactical response and firearms safety, I had reached a point in my career where I craved some semblance of peace. The constant pressure of preparing those who protect our communities had begun to wear on me, not because I did not love what I did, but because carrying the weight of such responsibility demanded a counterbalance. That is how I found myself purchasing a modest home in Oak Ridge Estates, a quiet subdivision with tree-lined streets and just enough space between houses to offer privacy without isolation. The property spoke to me immediately, a well-maintained ranch-style home with a generous backyard, and most importantly, a decent-sized shed that could be modified for secure storage of my training equipment. As Chief Firearms Instructor for the Regional Law Enforcement Academy, I had accumulated a substantial collection of training aids, simulation equipment, and educational materials that required proper storage. The Homeowners Association seemed reasonable when I first moved in. The bylaws were standard: restrictions on exterior paint colors, guidelines for lawn maintenance, rules about garbage can placement, nothing extraordinary or particularly burdensome. I made a point of introducing myself to several board members at a community picnic shortly after moving in, though I kept my professional credentials relatively private. In my experience, announcing one's connection to law enforcement often changes how people interact with you, and I wanted genuine relationships with my neighbors, not carefully curated public faces. I mentioned only that I worked in professional training and safety consultation, which was true enough without inviting the usual barrage of questions about guns and police work. For nearly 2 years, life in Oak Ridge Estates provided exactly what I had hoped for: a peaceful retreat from the intensity of my professional responsibilities. I maintained my property meticulously, attended the occasional HOA meeting, and built cordial relationships with neighbors. Then, last spring, I received notification of a significant contract expansion at the academy. The department had secured federal funding to develop enhanced training protocols for small-town departments across 3 states. This professional advancement was excellent news, but it also meant I would need additional secure storage space for new training modules and documentation. After carefully measuring my existing shed and the available yard space, I drafted plans for a modest extension, just 12 feet added to the rear of the structure, maintaining all setback requirements, and using materials identical to the original building. The extension would not be visible from the street, would affect no sightlines from neighboring properties, and most importantly, fell well within the HOA guidelines regarding auxiliary structures. I spent several evenings reviewing the bylaws, confirming my assessment with the county building department, and preparing a thoroughly documented application for the HOA Architectural Review Committee. The application included detailed blueprints, material specifications, contractor credentials, and even photographic mock-ups showing the minimal visual impact of the proposed extension. I submitted everything 6 weeks before my planned construction date, allowing ample time for the review process outlined in the HOA handbook. With my paperwork filed and my contractors tentatively scheduled, I felt confident that my carefully researched project would proceed smoothly. I had always been a methodical planner, a trait that served me well both professionally and personally. What I did not account for, however, was the recent change in HOA leadership that would turn this simple home improvement project into something far more challenging than I could have anticipated. 3 months before I submitted my application, the HOA had elected new board members, including a new president, Diane Whitmore, a middle-aged woman who had moved to the neighborhood approximately 1 year earlier. I had encountered her only briefly at a community meeting, where she had struck me as somewhat abrupt, but otherwise unremarkable. What I did not know then was that in the short time since her election, she had already developed a reputation among neighbors for selective rule enforcement and increasingly autocratic behavior. The first sign of trouble came from my next-door neighbor, Michael, who stopped by one evening as I was working in the garden. "Just wanted to give you a heads up about your shed plans," he said, keeping his voice low despite the privacy of my backyard. "Diane has been on a power trip lately. The Harrises across the street wanted to put in a similar extension for their gardening supplies last month, but she pushed the board to approve it because they are friends from her church. Then she rejected the Abani's application for a nearly identical project last week. Something about maintaining neighborhood aesthetics, though their design was completely within guidelines. I thanked Michael for the information, but did not give it much weight. After all, my application was meticulously prepared, and I was confident that even the most stringent interpretation of the bylaws would find no grounds for rejection. 3 weeks later, however, I received a tersely worded letter informing me that my application had been denied. The stated reason was vague, inconsistent with neighborhood standards, with no specific citations of bylaw violations or suggestions for modifications that might make the project acceptable. I immediately attempted to schedule a meeting with Diane to discuss the rejection. My initial email received an automatic response indicating she was unavailable. My follow-up phone call went to voicemail. A message left with the HOA management company resulted in a form response saying all architectural decisions were final unless appealed at the quarterly board meeting, which was still 6 weeks away. This systematic stonewalling was both frustrating and intriguing. In my professional life, I had encountered similar avoidance tactics from people who knew their position was indefensible. Rather than allowing frustration to guide my response, I decided to gather more information. I began by reaching out to other homeowners who had recently submitted architectural applications. Through these conversations, I discovered that my application was the only one denied from that month's review cycle, despite several others proposing more significant alterations to their properties. Particularly revealing was my conversation with Robert Chen, a recently retired attorney who had served on the Architectural Review Committee until stepping down the previous month. "I resigned because of Diane's approach," Robert told me over coffee at the local diner. "She has essentially taken over the committee, pressuring other members to vote her way or finding procedural reasons to exclude them from meetings. When your application came up, she made some comments I found disturbing." He hesitated before continuing. "She said she did not like having your type in the neighborhood and was concerned about what you might be storing in an expanded shed." When I asked what she meant by your type, she made vague references to your profession being concerning. This was perplexing, as I had been deliberately low-key about my work. When I mentioned this to Robert, he nodded. "Someone told her you work with law enforcement. She has some grudge against police. Got a hefty ticket last year for repeatedly parking in a fire lane at the shopping center. Apparently, she tried to get out of it by demanding to speak to supervisors, and it did not go well for her." This information clarified the situation considerably. I was facing not a procedural misunderstanding, but targeted discrimination. The revelation solidified my decision to attend the upcoming HOA meeting and address the issue publicly rather than continuing fruitless attempts at private resolution. I spent the intervening weeks gathering documentation, including examples of recently approved projects similar to mine and specific language from the bylaws supporting my application. I also reached out to several other board members, not to lobby for my case, but simply to introduce myself properly and establish that I was a reasonable, responsible homeowner. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community center, a modest building adjacent to the neighborhood pool. I arrived early, selecting a seat that would allow me to observe the dynamics between board members. The room gradually filled with homeowners, most there for routine business, though a few nodded in recognition of my situation. Diane arrived last, taking her place at the center of the table with an air of practiced authority. She wore a cream-colored blazer with gold buttons and a strand of pearls that she frequently touched while speaking, as if to emphasize her points. The meeting began with routine matters, approval of previous minutes, a treasurer's report, updates on landscaping contracts for common areas. I noticed that Diane frequently interrupted other board members, occasionally contradicting them on minor details as if to establish dominance. When the meeting finally opened for homeowner concerns, I was the third person called upon to speak. The first two had raised minor issues about pool hours and street parking that Diane dismissed with cursory responses. When I stood, I could feel her assessment sharpening, though I had not yet identified myself beyond my name and address. Thank you for this opportunity to address the board, I began, my voice carrying the measured calm I had perfected during decades of instructing tense recruits. I am here to discuss the rejection of my shed extension application, which I believe was made in error. I proceeded to distribute copies of my application materials to each board member, along with a one-page summary highlighting the specific bylaw provisions supporting my project. As you can see, my proposed extension meets all setback requirements, uses approved materials, maintains neighborhood aesthetics, and does not impact any sightlines from neighboring properties or public areas. Before I could continue, Diane cut in. Mr. Anderson, we have already reviewed and rejected your application. This meeting is not an appropriate venue to relitigate architectural decisions. Her tone carried the artificial patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. With respect, Madam President, I responded, maintaining even eye contact. Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws specifically states that homeowners may appeal architectural decisions at regular board meetings. I am exercising that right now. I turned slightly to address the full board rather than just Diane. I would appreciate the opportunity to understand specifically which provisions my application violated, as the rejection notice provided no actionable feedback. Diane's face tightened almost imperceptibly. The committee found your project inconsistent with neighborhood standards. We have concerns about property values and neighborhood character. She emphasized the last two words with a slight lift of her chin. I appreciate those concerns, I said, but could you please specify which standards were violated? I have here examples of 5 similar projects approved in the last year, including 3 since you became president. I placed the additional documentation on the table. All used similar materials and dimensions to my proposal, yet mine was the only one rejected. As I spoke, I noticed several homeowners nodding in agreement. 2 board members leaned forward to examine my documentation with evident interest. Diane noticed this shift in the room as well, and her response became more forceful. Every property is unique, Mr. Anderson. What works for one home may not work for another. The committee considered all factors in making its determination. Including factors not related to the bylaws, I asked quietly, because I have been unable to identify any provision my application violates. A murmur passed through the assembled homeowners. One of the board members, a woman named Patricia who had always been friendly during our brief encounters, spoke up. I was not aware this application was rejected. It did not come before the full board for review. The Architectural Committee has decision authority, Diane responded quickly. Not every application requires full board review. That is correct, I agreed. But Section 5.2 specifies that rejections should be reviewed by the full board if the homeowner requests it. I sent such a request 3 weeks ago. I produced a copy of my email and the receipt confirmation. The meeting continued in this vein for several more minutes, with increasing support from both homeowners and board members evident in their body language and occasional comments. Diane became progressively more defensive, her responses less coherent as she struggled to maintain control of the narrative. Finally, sensing the tide turning against her, she abruptly consulted her watch and announced, "We have several other matters on the agenda and limited time. This issue will need to be tabled until next month's meeting when we can devote proper attention to it." This procedural maneuver effectively cut off further discussion, as several homeowners had indeed been waiting patiently to address other concerns. I gathered my documents and thanked the board for their time, maintaining professional composure despite my frustration at the delay tactic. As people began to disperse following the conclusion of the meeting, I noticed Diane quickly exiting through a side door, avoiding the usual post-meeting mingling. I decided to make one final attempt at private resolution before escalating the matter further. I found Diane in the parking lot, walking briskly toward her white SUV. "Mrs. Whitmore," I called, maintaining a respectful distance. "Could we perhaps discuss this matter privately? I believe we could find a reasonable compromise that addresses your concerns while allowing my project to proceed." She turned sharply, her expression hardening as she recognized me. "There is nothing to discuss. The decision stands." Her voice had dropped the artificial pleasantness she maintained during the meeting, revealing a cold edge. "I understand your position," I replied calmly, "but I am simply trying to follow the established process. The bylaws are clear about my right to appeal, and I would prefer to resolve this cooperatively rather than through formal channels." Something in my measured response seemed to trigger a disproportionate reaction. "Listen," she hissed, stepping closer. "I know who you are and what you do. We do not need your kind bringing down property values in this neighborhood." Her voice had risen, attracting the attention of several homeowners still exiting the community center. "I am not certain what you mean by my kind," I responded, maintaining my calm demeanor despite her escalating hostility. "I am simply a homeowner requesting fair treatment under the bylaws we all agreed to follow." What happened next occurred with surprising speed. Diane's face flushed with anger as she stepped even closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Stop pushing this or you will regret it. I protect this neighborhood from people like you." In a fluid motion that betrayed practice rather than impulse, she reached into her purse and partially withdrew a small knife, not brandishing it openly, but ensuring I could see it. "Some of us are willing to do whatever it takes to keep our community safe." I took a calculated step backward, keeping my hands visible and my posture non-threatening, exactly the de-escalation technique I had taught to countless officers over the years. "Mrs. Whitmore, several people are watching us right now. I suggest you reconsider your current course of action." My voice remained steady, my gaze locked on hers rather than the weapon. "This is not a path that benefits either of us." For several seconds, tension hung in the air between us. Then, as if suddenly becoming aware of her surroundings, Diane glanced around and noticed that indeed, 3 homeowners had stopped to observe the confrontation from a distance. The realization that she had witnesses seemed to penetrate her anger. Without another word, she shoved the knife back into her purse, turned abruptly, and hurried to her vehicle. As she drove away, the observers approached me cautiously. "Are you all right?" asked an older gentleman I recognized from community gardening events. "We saw her pull something out. Was that a knife?" "It appeared to be," I confirmed, maintaining my composed exterior despite the seriousness of what had just transpired. "Would any of you be willing to provide a statement about what you observed?" All 3 immediately agreed, expressing shock at Diane's behavior. One woman, who introduced herself as Rebecca Lynn, mentioned she had experienced similar intimidation from Diane over a disputed garden trellis installation. "I just gave in because I did not want the conflict," she admitted. I never imagined she would escalate to actual threats. I thanked them for their concern and collected their contact information for follow-up. As we parted ways, Rebecca touched my arm gently. "Be careful," she warned. "Diane seems to have some serious issues with boundaries and authority." Instead of immediately reporting the incident to police, I drove home to consider my options carefully. As I sat in my home office reviewing the evening's events, I reflected on the irony of the situation. Diane had chosen to threaten perhaps the worst possible person in the neighborhood for such an approach. My entire professional life had been dedicated to training law enforcement officers in proper use of force, threat assessment, and conflict resolution. I had spent 20 years developing protocols for de-escalation and proportional response to threats, teaching officers how to navigate tense situations legally and ethically. This background gave me a unique perspective on the confrontation with Diane. I recognized her behavior not merely as a personal affront, but as a pattern of escalating intimidation that likely affected many homeowners. The knife incident represented not just a threat to my safety, but a dangerous abuse of power that undermined the entire community's well-being. My response needed to address both the immediate threat and the systemic issue it represented. I began by carefully documenting everything that had occurred, creating a detailed timeline from my initial application through the knife incident. I then sent individual emails to the 3 witnesses, asking them to provide written accounts of what they had observed in the parking lot. Within hours, all 3 had responded with statements confirming that Diane had appeared to threaten me with a concealed weapon while making verbal threats. Next, I reviewed the HOA bylaws with renewed attention, this time focusing not on architectural guidelines but on governance procedures and conduct requirements for board members. I discovered multiple instances where Diane had violated established protocols, failing to recuse herself from decisions involving personal bias, conducting committee business without proper quorum, rejecting applications without specified cause, and most importantly, failing to forward appeals to the full board as required. These procedural violations provided a separate but parallel track for addressing the situation beyond the criminal threat. While I could certainly file a police report about the knife incident, I recognized that combining it with action through HOA channels might create more comprehensive and lasting change for the community. This approach aligned with my professional philosophy that true security comes from systems and communities functioning properly, not merely from punishing individual transgressions. Over the next few days, I reached out discreetly to current and former board members, building a coalition of concerned homeowners. Many expressed relief that someone was finally challenging Diane's increasingly autocratic behavior. I learned that several homeowners had experienced similar intimidation, but felt powerless to address it individually. A picture emerged of systematic abuse of power, extending well beyond my shed application. I also consulted with former colleagues in law enforcement and legal affairs, seeking advice on the most appropriate way to handle the criminal aspect of the confrontation. Their unanimous counsel was to file a police report to establish an official record, regardless of whether I chose to pursue charges immediately. "Document everything," advised Maria Chen, a prosecutor I had worked with on training programs. "Even if this incident is resolved through HOA channels, having an official record protects you and others if her behavior escalates further." By the end of the week, I had compiled a comprehensive dossier documenting both Diane's procedural violations and the pattern of intimidation reported by multiple homeowners. Rather than focusing on personal grievances, I framed the issue in terms of governance standards and community safety, an approach that would be more difficult for Diane or her allies to dismiss as a personal vendetta. I also made a decision about my shed extension. It would proceed as planned. The rejection had been procedurally improper, failing to cite specific bylaw violations and ignoring my right to appeal. While I would continue pursuing proper authorization through HOA channels, I would not allow an invalid rejection to prevent a project that clearly complied with all legitimate requirements. The following Monday, I contacted several contractors to schedule the work. By Wednesday morning, the permit was posted, and survey stakes marked the planned extension footprint. I deliberately chose to begin the process openly, in daylight hours, following all county regulations meticulously. If Diane chose to challenge the construction, she would need to do so through proper channels rather than intimidation. As expected, Diane appeared at my property within hours of the first delivery of building materials. I was supervising the unloading when her white SUV screeched to a halt in front of my house. She emerged looking simultaneously furious and triumphant, clutching a folder I presumed contained HOA documentation. "What do you think you are doing?" she demanded, marching up my driveway without waiting for an invitation. "Your application was denied. This construction is unauthorized, and you will be fined $500 per day until it is removed." I had anticipated this confrontation and prepared accordingly. My phone was already recording in my pocket, legal in our state, which required only single-party consent for recordings. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore," I responded calmly. "I am proceeding with a code-compliant improvement to my property. The rejection of my application was procedurally invalid as it failed to cite specific bylaw violations and ignored my right to appeal to the full board." Her eyes narrowed at my measured response. "The architectural committee rejected your application. That is final." "Actually, it is not," I replied, maintaining my professional tone. Section 5.2 of the bylaws specifies that rejections must include specific citations of compliance failures and that homeowners may appeal to the full board. Neither provision was honored in my case. I have documented these procedural failures and submitted them to the HOA management company. Diane seemed momentarily thrown by my specific citation of the bylaws but quickly recovered. "I am the president of this HOA. If I say your project is denied, it is denied." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. I have already instructed our attorney to prepare a cease and desist order. If you continue, you will face legal consequences beyond fines. I noticed she was careful to maintain distance and keep her hands visible, clearly aware that our previous encounter had witnesses. I appreciate your position, I responded, but I believe you are exceeding your authority under the bylaws. If you wish to contest this project properly, I suggest you call an emergency board meeting as provided for in Section 3.7. Until then, I will proceed with construction that complies with all applicable codes and legitimate HOA requirements. Her face flushed with anger, but she seemed unsure how to respond to my calm citation of specific bylaw provisions. "This is not over," she finally stated, turning to leave. "You will regret this defiance." "Mrs. Whitmore," I called after her, "I hope you will reconsider your approach. Collaborative problem-solving would benefit everyone involved." She did not respond, simply returning to her vehicle and driving away with unnecessary acceleration. The confrontation set the tone for the following weeks of construction. Diane employed various intimidation tactics, parking across from my house for hours, photographing workers and deliveries, attempting to speak with my contractors when I was not present. Each incident was carefully documented and added to my growing file. The contractors, whom I had briefed about the situation, remained professional throughout, though several commented on the unusualness of such intense HOA scrutiny. What Diane did not anticipate was the community response her actions would generate. Neighbors began stopping by with refreshments for the workers, expressing support for my project, and sharing their own stories of difficulties with the HOA under Diane's leadership. Many were impressed by the care we were taking to ensure the extension matched the existing structure perfectly and maintained neighborhood aesthetics. Several mentioned they had been considering similar projects, but had been hesitant to navigate the HOA process after hearing about recent arbitrary rejections. The construction proceeded efficiently despite the ongoing harassment. The foundation was poured, framing completed, and exterior finishes applied with meticulous attention to matching the original structure. As the project neared completion, I prepared to implement the next phase of my response to Diane's misconduct, the formal and legal accountability that her actions warranted. With the construction of my shed extension completed, I moved forward with the comprehensive response I had been preparing since the knife incident. The first step was filing a formal police report documenting the threat. I provided the written statements from witnesses and requested a restraining order based on the combination of the weapon threat and subsequent harassment during construction. The responding officer, who took my statement with professional attention, seemed particularly concerned when I described the seemingly practiced way Diane had produced the knife. "This does not sound like a heat-of-the-moment action," he noted. "The motion you are describing suggests someone accustomed to using intimidation tactics." When he asked about my occupation, I provided my full credentials for the first time, explaining my role as Chief Firearms Instructor for the Regional Law Enforcement Academy. His demeanor shifted subtly, not with the typical deference civilians sometimes show upon learning of law enforcement connections, but with professional recognition of a credible witness with relevant expertise. "Your background lends significant weight to this report," he acknowledged. "Your assessment of threat behavior aligns with what we look for in these cases." The preliminary protective order was granted within hours, temporarily barring Diane from approaching my property or initiating contact with me. A hearing for a permanent restraining order was scheduled for the following week. Simultaneously with the police report, I submitted a comprehensive package to the HOA board and management company. This document detailed not only Diane's procedural violations regarding my application, but the pattern of selective enforcement, intimidation, and governance failures documented by multiple homeowners. Most significantly, it included information about the knife incident, complete with witness statements and the police report number. I formally requested an emergency board meeting under Section 3.7 of the bylaws, citing urgent safety and governance concerns that cannot wait for regular meeting schedules. The management company, suddenly facing potential liability for failing to address documented misconduct by a board officer, responded with unprecedented speed. The emergency meeting was scheduled for the following evening, with notice sent to all homeowners as required by bylaws. My restraining order against Diane created an interesting procedural complication. As the complainant in the matter under discussion, I needed to be present, but her presence would violate the protective order. The management company resolved this by arranging for Diane to participate remotely via video conference, while I attended in person. To prepare for the meeting, I arranged for several of my colleagues from the Law Enforcement Training Academy to attend, not as intimidation, but as character witnesses regarding my professional reputation and expertise in threat assessment. Their presence would lend additional credibility to my testimony about the seriousness of Diane's actions while demonstrating my deep connections to the law enforcement community. Connections that made Diane's attempt at intimidation particularly ill-advised. The emergency board meeting drew the largest attendance in the HOA's history. The community center was filled beyond capacity, with some homeowners standing along the walls. Board members looked simultaneously uncomfortable and relieved, uncomfortable with the public scrutiny, but relieved that long-standing issues were finally being addressed. A large screen at the front of the room displayed Diane's video feed, her expression a mixture of defiance and apprehension as she observed the unprecedented turnout. When the meeting was called to order, the management company representative explained the unusual format necessitated by the restraining order and outlined the serious nature of the allegations being addressed. I was then invited to present my concerns, which I did with professional detachment, focusing initially on the procedural violations rather than the criminal threat. These systemic failures in governance have created an environment where arbitrary decisions replace fair process, I explained, displaying documentation of multiple inconsistent application decisions. When homeowners cannot rely on bylaws being applied consistently and transparently, the entire purpose of an HOA is undermined. Only after establishing this pattern of governance failures did I address the parking lot confrontation. The production of a weapon during a dispute over HOA matters represents an extraordinary escalation that cannot be separated from the leadership position Mrs. Whitmore holds. I presented the witness statements and police report number. This was not merely a personal disagreement, but an abuse of perceived authority backed by threat of violence. When given her opportunity to respond, Diane attempted to characterize the incident as a misunderstanding. I felt threatened by Mr. Anderson's aggressive approach after the meeting, she claimed. I was simply protecting myself, and I never actually pointed any weapon at him. At this point, one of the witnesses who had been present in the parking lot stood up without being called. That is absolutely false, she stated firmly. Mr. Anderson maintained a respectful distance throughout the conversation. Mrs. Whitmore was the one who approached him aggressively. I saw her reach into her purse and show him something she was gripping. It looked like a knife handle. Her body language was threatening, not defensive. Two other witnesses immediately echoed this account, creating a devastating counterpoint to Diane's attempted narrative. The mood in the room shifted palpably as homeowners realized they were not dealing with a simple procedural dispute, but a serious abuse of power. It was at this point that I finally revealed my full professional background. For context that may be relevant to assessing this situation, I have spent 20 years training law enforcement officers in threat assessment, de-escalation, and appropriate response to potentially violent confrontations. My current position is Chief Firearms Instructor at the Regional Law Enforcement Academy, where I develop protocols for officers throughout the state on handling confrontations safely and legally. A murmur passed through the assembled homeowners as this information registered. I continued. I mention this not to intimidate, but to explain why I responded to Mrs. Whitmore's threat with de-escalation rather than confrontation, and why I am particularly concerned about such behavior from someone in a leadership position. My professional assessment is that this was not an isolated incident of poor judgment, but part of a pattern of using intimidation to control community decisions. The revelation of my credentials visibly deflated Diane on the video screen. Her subsequent attempts to minimize the incident lacked conviction, especially as more homeowners came forward with accounts of similar intimidation they had experienced. One particularly powerful testimony came from an elderly resident who described abandoning plans for a medical necessity ramp after Diane had implied that accidents happen to properties that violate HOA standards. After nearly 2 hours of testimony, the board moved to executive session to deliberate. When they returned 30 minutes later, their decision was unanimous. Diane would be immediately removed from her position as president and board member under the bylaw's provisions for misconduct. Additionally, her HOA privileges would be suspended until she completed a community mediation program and acknowledged in writing her understanding of appropriate board conduct. In a surprising development, the board also voted to offer me a position to complete Diane's term. Your knowledge of governance procedures and commitment to fair application of the bylaws would be valuable in helping restore proper functioning to our HOA, explained Patricia, who had been elevated to interim president. We need leadership that understands both the letter and spirit of community governance. I accepted the position with one condition: that the board commit to a comprehensive review of all architectural decisions made during Diane's tenure, with remediation for any homeowners whose applications were improperly rejected. This condition was readily accepted, reflecting the board's genuine desire to restore proper governance. Diane, still participating remotely, remained silent during these proceedings. Her video feed disappeared shortly after the vote was announced. The following day, she received formal notification of the board's decision by certified mail, along with information about the restraining order hearing scheduled for the following week. That hearing proceeded without drama. Diane did not contest the order, likely realizing that opposition would only create additional public record of her actions. The permanent restraining order was granted, legally preventing her from approaching my property or initiating contact with me for 1 year, with provisions for extension if necessary. The months following these events brought significant positive changes to our community. As a board member, I helped lead a comprehensive review of HOA procedures, with particular focus on creating transparent standards for architectural decisions. We revised unclear bylaws, created detailed guidelines with visual examples of acceptable modifications, and implemented a tracking system to ensure consistent application of standards across all properties. My completed shed extension became something of a model for appropriate home improvements, aesthetically harmonious with the original structure and surrounding neighborhood, functionally meeting my professional needs without impacting neighbors' enjoyment of their properties. Several homeowners who had previously abandoned improvement plans due to fears of arbitrary rejection returned to the newly reformed Architectural Committee with their proposals, most of which were approved under the clarified guidelines. The community began to heal from the divisiveness of Diane's leadership. A block party organized in late summer drew record attendance, with many residents expressing appreciation for the more collaborative atmosphere. Diane herself eventually sold her home and moved from the neighborhood after her unsuccessful attempt to contest the board's decision through the management company's corporate office. The legal documentation of her threats proved insurmountable in her effort to characterize her removal as procedurally improper. Perhaps the most satisfying outcome was the community safety workshop I hosted in my backyard once the shed extension was completed. Designed to offer neighbors practical advice on personal safety and conflict de-escalation, the event drew over 30 residents curious to learn from my professional expertise. Standing beside the shed that had become the unlikely catalyst for community transformation, I shared techniques for navigating conflicts productively and recognizing the difference between assertiveness and aggression. True power comes not from intimidation, but from knowledge, procedure, and community standards applied fairly, I explained to the assembled neighbors. The same principles that guide professional law enforcement apply to community governance: transparency, consistency, and respect for established processes protect everyone involved. As twilight descended and neighbors lingered to continue conversations, I reflected on the unexpected journey from simple shed extension to community reformation. My professional training had prepared me not just to respond effectively to Diane's threat, but to help build more resilient community governance in its aftermath. The skills I had spent decades teaching to law enforcement officers had proven equally valuable in civilian conflict resolution. The shed extension now served its intended purpose, providing secure storage for my training equipment and materials. But it had also served a purpose I never anticipated, becoming a symbol of proper process and fair governance for our community. Sometimes, I realized, fighting for justice in your own neighborhood can be just as important as training those who protect society professionally. Both require the same fundamental commitment to principles over power, to systems over shortcuts, to community well-being over personal advantage.